Good evening and welcome, and thank you all very much for coming. This is a great crowd, especially for an FIT event from 5 to 6. I applaud you and I congratulate you and I welcome you. My name is Patrick Knisley. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts here at FIT, and it is National Poetry Month. We are blessed tonight, doubly. It's National Poetry Month, and we have a great poet to speak to us. This event is sponsored by the English and Communication Studies Department, which is part of the School of Liberal Arts. And Amy Lemon is the chair of the department. She's done a lot for the cause of poetry at FIT over the years and continues to do so. She's had Molly Peacock, Mark Strand, rest in peace, Claudia Rankin, Brittany Parham, Monica Yoon, Ocean Vuong. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but a stellar cast of poets who've come to speak to our students here at FIT. And we're very proud of that, and we're very proud of the School of Liberal Arts here. So I'm going to turn this over to Amy, who will introduce you to our poet tonight. But once again, thanks so much for coming and for participating in this event, and happy Poetry Month.
Thank you, Dean Knisley. I'm Amy Lemon. A lot of you know me. Chairperson of English and Communication Studies. I also teach poetry writing, creative writing, and creative imagination, theory, and process. We good with this? Is this going to work? Okay. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements regarding National Poetry Month. The International Student Services Office is sponsoring some events on Tuesdays from 1 to 2, and there's some flyers over there that you can pick up. Next week, they're having a generative workshop where you can write your own poems on culture and identity, taught by Javon Howard, a Bronx-born poet who performs under the moniker Righteous Teacher, which is pretty awesome. And then there's an event on the 17th with dance and painting and poetry, and then open mic, all of you writers, April 24th. So please pick up, if you're interested, there's flyers over there. The English and Communication Studies Department, it's like all of our events are in April or something. But we're co-sponsoring with Film and Media Studies next Tuesday at this same time, actually at 6:30, in D207, which is the screening room. Those of you who might know the film screening room series. Evan Jackson Long will be in person. There will be a screening of his film Snakehead. And we're very excited about that. And then next Wednesday, co-sponsored with the Art Speak series, which is fine arts and history of art professors, Siri Hustvedt will be giving a talk, The Creative Practitioner and the Expanded Studio. So that's pretty cool. That's on a Wednesday from 5 to 6, and that is in the Katie Murphy Amphitheater. So lots of things going on this month. We're really glad that you're here. I'm very excited to introduce Phillis Levin. I've known Phillis for many years, and when I first met her, she was my teacher. So you get to see my teacher, those of you who are my students. Phillis was teaching a private workshop on the lyric sequence. So this means connected series of shorter poems. And my main image of that, my visual image, is Phillis coming laden with tons and tons of handouts. And one of the things she was doing at the time, this was in the late 90s, was collecting sonnets. How many of you know what a sonnet is? 14 lines, right? For the Penguin book of the sonnet, of which she was the editor. A huge undertaking. So that's one of the many things that she's done. Not only is she a well-published poet, but she's also an editor of such things and an amazing teacher. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about her accomplishments. She's also an essayist, in addition to being a poet and editor. Her 5th book of poems, which is for sale over there, thanks to our bookstore, Mr. Memory and Other Poems, was selected by Library Journal as one of their top picks in poetry for spring 2016. In a review for the Huffington Post, Carol Muskie-Dukes wrote, Levin enacts intense longing in these expansive meditative poems and moves from the social to the metaphysical with enviable ease, in touch with the wonder of being everywhere at once. She's the author of 4 other poetry collections, She's been honored with such awards as the Norma Farber First Book Award, a Fulbright Scholarship to Slovenia, the Amy Lowell Traveling Poetry Scholarship, many, many others, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation. These are all like the huge, the big awards everyone wants to get when they're writers and artists. Her work has appeared in many magazines, including The Atlantic, Kenyon Review, The Nation, The New Yorker, The New York Times Sunday Magazine, Paris Review, Poetry, and many others. She currently is Professor of English and Poet in Residence at Hofstra University. Please join me in welcoming Phillis Levin.
Thank you so much for making me welcome, making me feel welcome. Patrick nicely, it's a pleasure to meet you. After all these years, your name has floated. Molly Peacock, a dear friend. And Amy, it's really moving to see you in your glory here, because Amy is such a fine poet and brilliant teacher and scholar. And I sort of, sometimes it is, I think it's, you know, when you watch a wheel moving at a certain point, it moves in its opposite direction. And so I sometimes think, are you my teacher or am I yours? Which was it? I'm going to try to pay attention to the time. So I'm going to read one poem from my fourth collection, May Day, and then a small number from Mr. Memory and Other Poems, and then some newer poems. And after that, I think there's a Q&A, yes? My fourth collection is called May Day in the pagan sense, Maypole, and also May Day in the international call of distress. Help me is what it means in French, May Day. But then it got transliterated to May Day, so that no matter what your language is, if somebody has hit your plane and you are going down, you say May Day. All of the poems were written in some way in the shadow of September 11th, 2001, though none of them directly refer, except for one, and I'm not reading that one. There is a needle in the sky, being threaded now, but the thread is blue. That is why you cannot see it threading its way. When all is said and done, it will keep sewing, as long as a tiny knot remains, as long as something whets the tip whenever the knot happens to untie, as long as the sun arouses the wind that catches the thread again, twisting an end so that it may begin. There is a needle pulling a thread through your veins. A needle pulling the sap from the root to the bowl. A thread pulling a bird to a tree. Tugging your heart as soon as you believe there is nothing left. There is a glistening filament, a cold instrument making its way from once upon a time to now to tomorrow. Maybe the sun is a giant spool. Maybe the needle cannot rest until it runs out of light. Maybe a star is a random stitch unraveling. Until the needle runs out of thread, it is impossible to look into its eye. We're all connected to each other, obviously, because we're humans. But I think in particular here, Fashion Institute of Technology, what strikes me is that you're all in one way or another involved in the making of things that reach other people, something tactile. And what we spoke about in my visit today to Michael Carmen's class is the texture of things and the joy in making something, the particularities of things, how they hold histories, personal and cultural. And we never really know what happens on the metaphysical level to the objects we create that are then passed on to others. We can only do our best to make the object be true to itself, even more so than to our vision for what we want it to be. And I think all of you in some way are involved in that, whether you're designing textiles or doing something with plastic or whatever it is. You're all involved in making, in poiesis, which is the making of things. So it's really a great joy for me to be among you, knowing that you're all makers. Fame. I will disappear into the sea and not be heard from. By moonlight, rise up galloping upon a blue horse born in my blood. We're coming right out of Easter. This is a poem entitled Lenten Song. Lent actually means spring in Old English. Lenten Song. That the dead are real to us cannot be denied. That the living are more real when they are dead terrifies. That the dead can rise as the living do is possible to surmise. But all the stars cannot come near all we meet in an eye. Flee from me, fear. As soot flies in a breeze, do not burn or settle in my sight. I've tasted you long enough. Let me savor something otherwise. Who wakes beside me now suits my soul. So I turn to words, only to say he changes into his robe, rustles a page. He raises the lid of the piano to release what's born in its cage. If words come back to say they compromise or swear again they have died, there's no news in that, I reply. But a music without notes, these notes comprise, still as spring beneath us lies, already something otherwise. One of the things that some students noticed in Michael Carmen's class is the centrality of objects in my work, which I am not that aware of because I don't look outside myself. So there are several, or more than several poems in conversation with objects. In this particular case, this is a poem in the voice of the pair of shoes that Anne Frank briefly owned. They were bought at a pawn shop for her by Miepke's, the woman who, with her husband, hid the Frank family. And if any of you are able to, tomorrow at Book Culture on Columbus, which is around 82nd Street and Columbus Avenue, somebody named Robin Leslie Gold is going to be reading from a new book of hers called Mittens, Miep, and Shovelfuls of Dirt. And Miep is the Miep, the Austrian woman who, as a small child, was sent to Holland because she was emaciated and her parents were afraid she would die of starvation, and a Dutch family adopted her. And she's the person who then grew up to be the person who was taken in and treated so beautifully by these Dutch children, not as an outsider, but embraced by these Dutch children, and who then later embraced the Frank family. And it's also the same person, this Robin Leslie Gold, who wrote with Miepke's Miep's memoir. We all have an experience of awakening to what's called, I guess, morality, ethics, and it happens at a very young age, usually around 7. I guess I was 6. And it haunted, I still wonder where Victor is and would like to ask him how he is and to apologize. I think that's a human thing. I'm going to read some new poems. I think I should switch. I know I should. Hold on one sec. It rained a lot today. I love the rain. I think, again, rain is something that connects people, all people. There's something about bad weather that is so refreshing because things are going on outside of us instead of inside of us. So we all have the same issue. It's raining. This is called An Anthology of Rain. For this, you may see no need. You may think my aim dead set on something devoid of conceivable value. an anthology of rain. A collection of voices telling someone somewhere what it means to follow a drop, traveling to its final place of rest. But do consider this request. If you have pressed your nose of any shape against a window, odor of metal, faint, persistent, while a storm cast its cloak over the shoulder of every cloud in sight. You are free to say whatever crosses your mind when you look at the face of time and the passing of one drop gathering speed, one drop chasing another, racing to a fork in the path, lingering before making a detour to join another, fattening on the way until entering a rivulet, running to the sill. So please accept this invitation. You are welcome to submit. There is no limit to its limit. Even the instructions are a breeze as long as you include nothing about yourself except your name. Your address remains unnecessary, for the rain will find you. If you receive it, it receives you. Whether or not you contribute, a volume is sent. And when you lift the collection, you may hear by opening anywhere. A drop and its story reappear as air turns to water, water to air. This is a poem I never read. It's quite a new poem. It's coming out in the Yale Review in the next issue. And I specifically thought this poem is one I should read at FIT, if anywhere, because it's about passion. More particularly, the poem is actually in the voice of a tailor, who is also a great artist, meaning tailors, just as architects and stonemasons were the same at a certain time in history before we split everything up. Tailors, would make fashions, right? Not just sew. And the poem is in the voice of a tailor whose name we do not and probably will never know. It is lost to history. But he is known to us because he was painted by one of the greatest late Renaissance painters, who himself was forgotten for a very, very long time and then rediscovered. I saw his work in London and in a show that then became a sensation, and now this particular painting is almost never in London because so many museums around the world want it. And the painting is called Il Tagliapani, which just means the tailor in Italian. Cut, taglia. And the painter's name is Giovanni Battista Moroni. And I'm not going to say much more because this poem is so embedded in history, but it should work without you knowing the history. The only thing I will say is that when Moroni was living, it was at a time when there were a lot of warring factions and a lot of tribalism inside of what is today called Italy. Italy didn't yet exist as a country. There was the Republic of Venice. There was a huge influence of the Spanish Empire, which was so powerful. And due to its power, certain people dressed in the Spanish fashion, which was sort of like New York. Everything was black. And so people who were super stylish would wear black. And one of the things Moroni does is paint these aristocrats in very fashionable clothing. And one of the fascinating things about the particular painting that sparked this poem is that the tailor is cutting the cloth that you see turning into the costume or the clothing worn by the other people in the other paintings. So it's quite remarkable. So the poem is in the voice of the tailor. It's a dramatic monologue. Moroni's Tailor. On a black cloth, a line of chalk marks the course my scissors must follow. You follow its path, dabbing at your palette, tending to my likeness faithfully, until stepping back into the light, taking you further each day from the weight of your father's toolbox. Chisels and mallets set in separate chambers, plans translated by sweat into columns, arches, turrets, tombs. Your unerring hand proves you are his son, though you combine powder and oil instead of sand and lime. And you abide by a tempo that dwells not in the ring of steel on marble, but a bell calling the quarter hour, thickening the air the people of Albino move within before dispersing, going home to evening prayer, yielding to pigeons that occupy the square, waves of them, changing patterns at every turn, as if design, not direction, were all that matters. You prefer to face each face alone. A gentleman in pink brocade standing with a sword by a ruined wall. A lady in solemn jet whose finger keeps her place in a book of verse written by another noble sitter. In the gray lining of her sleeve, the layer of lace at his wrist, my skill, as well as yours, resides. You would rather alter an angle to sharpen character, render a gaze defying decay, disarming any of us who enter where they live on, carrying their immaculate dignity into our uncertain future. Bergamo is falling to strangers, the republic divided, even the churches are not free of blood. You lean your canvas on an easel, I stretch my fabric on a table. You dress them in the Spanish fashion, cutting darkness from darkness. So do I. Here is material fit for a man who stays away from the clash of knives, avoids an oath that could end in war, the stain of exile. Today, Giovanni, I prepare the cloth. You have given my semblance a soul, done justice to my form, shown the bare room where I reign. But see to the ruffle at my throat so they know how far I have come. Better to remain in Albino beyond the noise of fame. Aloof as a courtesan, Venice once displayed herself to me in an alley where I met a merchant selling the finest silk. Visible from the door of his little shop, an immense flag billowed on a facade across the canal, a stone's throw from where I stood. I paused at the same spot later, savoring my acquisition, a weave embroidered with silver thread. But the banner beckoned, liquid in the wind, then familiar. It was the crest of your favorite patron, whose doublet needed new buttons for carnival. I saved a piece of velvet for them. When I couldn't reach the palace on foot or find a gondolier to row me there, that rippling emblem, mutable as flame, mutable as water, seemed like a garment meant for a time hereafter. Obscurity may be no more than a phantom obstruction, my friend, an error of sight. Just as a shadow may cast the shape of a chasm, pretending depth, though nothing is below. Today, my scissors follow the chalk. Tomorrow, I will help you make your name. So in its own strange way, this Tailor is what made Moroni famous. It is considered the first portrait that is truly psychological, where you look at the portrait and you see a soul, you see a person recognizable. And anyone who sees this painting is smitten by it and just cannot believe it. And then they go, oh my God, when was this painted? And it was painted 1570. It's a psychological realism that we take for granted today. I hope you get to see it, or at least a picture of it. I have about 5 minutes, I think, so I want to wrap up. I'm going to read 2 short poems. I'll end with the poem I read to the class, but since most of you weren't there, and then I'll read, it's 2 short poems. This one is called Contentment, and this is one of these poems where the title segues into the poem itself, so that the first word of the poem is its own title. In this case, a noun, an abstract noun. Contentment. Exhales a note. A bullfrog bellows. A mallard finds its mate on another shore. And in the rushes, no rushing, unless the rustle of wing on water counts. So a day is spent, unspent, spinning a web from bough to bough, ample enough to entertain a rainbow, nimble enough to balance a bead of dew. Another momentary globe. Ear of corn. An ear of corn, alone in the wind, stirred from slumber, rustles. Beads of gold bubbling under a tangle of silky hair. So many others fill the same field, row by row, one by one, repeating a rumor started by the sun. A stalk of corn guards the dawn. Umber tassel glistening, blade uplifted, listening. Thy will be done. Thy will be done. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. So we'll just ask, we'll pass around the microphone. Because that means your question will be on the video. So who would like to ask the first question?
Am I supposed to be standing in this particular spot?
That's probably the best, just because of the microphone. Here we go. Ashley.
A lot of your poems that you said today had a lot of inspiration from your childhood. How has that changed as you've grown up? When you were younger, did you write about maybe the future, or what brought you to looking back more now?
Well, you've already said it. One looks back, can't look back if one isn't away, right? Unlike many people, I started impersonally, very impersonal, cold even, people would say. Where are you? And I don't want to be here. I don't need to be in this picture. I'm making something. So I think as I got older, I maybe relaxed a little, got warmer. The more confident one is as an artist, maybe the more one can take the chance. And I do believe that one of the biggest risks in life is being sentimental. That is, the fear of being sentimental stops a lot of people from the things they need to do. Because it's so embarrassing to be sentimental. One has to be cool, right? And being cool can eliminate much of what is the soul of things. It's like Kafka said, he has these wonderful parables and paradoxes, and I mean, he's not directly speaking about this, but it is germane. Two truths, and this is of course a translation from German into English, two truths at the center of life. To narrow one's circle more and more, and constantly to make sure one has not left oneself out somewhere outside of it. And it's sort of you got to focus. You got to have a major. You got to have a sub-major and a super atomic sub-major. And wait a minute, I'm not in here anymore. And he's talking. I think it doesn't end. That the truth of what he says. That we're in danger of leaving ourselves outside of the circle that we narrow. So I suppose I allow myself, I've always was interested in the world, but I didn't want to be in it. I mean, as a child, I used to try to look at a mirror without seeing myself in it. I'm sure I'm not the only child who did that, but I spent an enormous amount of time seeing why can't I see a mirror without myself? It's like trying to have a purely scientific observation, and all these theories of physics have since disproved the impossibility of total objectivity, but I didn't know that. I was 2 or 3. But then again, they're transformed. So even if I'm using memory, it is the great source for poetry, always, I think, childhood memory, but it's what one does with it. Anyone else? Yes.
For some reason, I wanted to ask you, what do you think of puns?
puns, meaning within poems. That's a highly specific, interesting question. And it's connected to the embarrassment of sentimentality. That is, we get pleasure from puns, but puns can be too pithy, too clever. They're related to rhyme. So I would say a pun that opens into something more profound doesn't simply just get a little laugh or an eyebrow raised, can be effective. But once one does it a few too many times. I mean, you say in Hamlet, meaning that is, Shakespeare knew the danger of puns, but he creates realities in which punning is essential, but there's a context for the pun, right? And punning is connected to madness, right? I have close family ties, I wear them around my neck. Right? No, I mean that one of the marks of the breakdown of language is the over-literalization of things. And puns are connected to that psychic phenomena of the literal figurative being collapsed. So, what do you think?
Oh, well, I generally like, sometimes because we have poems that are so serious, it seems in this time. And use of a turn of phrase or a pun, you might say, oh, that's corny or sentimental, but it sort of relieves a ongoing tension.
Yeah.
So I appreciate Shakespeare, and everybody does, because of the comic relief
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
pacing, and for language that's spoken aloud.
Yeah.
You're speaking aloud, so that it gets thicker. There's lightness here and there, but it's on the page. It's not so much in voice.
Yeah.
And I think writers today are forced not to perform. But you read the poem as it is strongly. It is a performance, but let's say you recall Russian poets would come to the United States, and they were, of course, pent up. And
Mayakovsky.
Yeah. A chance to release all this tension of being in this governmental, dictatorship. But it was a tradition anyway. I mean, they were performing.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do it here. And so I sometimes miss those little.
Well, those are two different things, but they're related to
Right.
the perception of things performative. I've always known my work by heart. At a certain point, I started looking at the page simply because people got too attentive to my knowing it by heart, and they were paying more attention to my ability to recite than what the words were. But then I get lost. If I start reciting from memory and then look down, I sort of don't know where I am, because I realize, did I just recite 20 lines or 30 lines? So it gets confusing. But I mean, this is a very personal confession, but it's not too personal. When I was a freshman at Sarah Lawrence College, Joseph Brodsky, who later became a friend, Joseph Brodsky read. His English was okay, but he was with a translator. He had just come to the United States. He was probably there only 1 year at the most. And he read in Russian. And it was the first time I ever heard anyone read poetry the way I felt poetry in my mind and body. And he was reading in Russian, and I don't know Russian. But I completely recognized what he was doing. I was like, that's how I feel poetry when I write it, those very rhythms. So I know what you're talking about. It's very suspect in some cultures, and that's very complicated, all the reasons for that.
Yeah, and there's the repetition that you get, like when you were reading
Dandelion.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, they're always repeating it, sort of.
The refrain.
But the refrain, it brings you back, and if you choose a different elocution of
Right,
it, it might
right.
be something. So.
I knew there was a risk in doing that. People go, what's wrong with her? Why is she repeating it? But it's not just a refrain, it's incantatory. And repetition, it's like spells. They lift us out of, one of the earliest uses of language is to alter consciousness. That's what we do with poetry. We alter, we restructure consciousness through rhythm, which is what music does. So that's, and punning is a restructuring because it takes a word as we know it and then flips it and like, oh, you thought it was this, but it's this. And of course, in a language such as English, where there's so many homonyms, it's such a rich language for pun.
Right. There's all languages in it.
But too many of them, what happens is then the reader or audience starts distrusting the performer because it's as if the performer is so proud of the ability to produce puns that that becomes the issue more than what is being said.
Yeah, they will want the audience to get it.
Yeah,
so they
yeah,
lean on it
yeah.
too hard.
It becomes a show-off thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's always these issues. Yes, other questions?
I just wanted to dovetail a little bit into, you mentioned etymology, the history of words, and
Yes.
and we're talking about language, we're talking about playing with language and the rhythms that language can be created with language. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your generative process and how language is part of that, how subject is part of that, like what the relationship is, because I know there are a lot of creative and artistic people in this room, whether they're writing in words or using other media. Does it start with the material, or does it start, what's the relationship between the material, which with poetry is words, and the subject or the theme or the image or the other kinds of content, shall we say?
I never start with a theme or an idea, because that's totally destroys, I mentioned this to Michael Carmen's class, because then one has already metabolized the poetry. One is at a remove from it. One has to be inside the language. It's like talking about water rather than being inside of the pool or the river. And I don't like repeating myself, though I like refrains, and so I don't like doing the same thing twice. So as an artist, I'm very aware of managing my material, but I always feel as if I have to follow what comes to me. I mean, that's sort of the gift. So, for example, a phrase might come to me or a rhythm might come to me, and I follow it. And where does it take me? At a certain point, I realize, it seems to want to be in tercets, or it seems to want to be in long lines, or alternate, or I have to listen to the material. It's a lot like sports. I'm not an athlete, but I remember many years ago, I gave a poetry reading at New York Institute of Technology. The majority of people in the audience were young men who were highly involved in sports. And I was warned, these people aren't going to like poetry. But they were actually very engaged with poetry, and they had some good questions, and one of them was the obvious, how do you do this, and how do you revise, and, it's a process question. How do you know what to do next? How do you know? And I said, I have the feeling you all know the answer to this. Does anyone here play a sport? So they were like, all raised their hands. I said, well, somebody volunteered to say what it's like to, say, play basketball. Yeah. And then I said to this young man whose name I don't remember, so how do you know what to do next? He looked at me like I'm nuts, which is what I look, He said, the instant tells you what to do. Now, that's the best answer I've ever heard. The instant tells you what to do. And that's it. But you've got to have the training to know what to do in that instant, right? Because if someone throws me on the ball, I am not going to be able to do what he does in that instant. But the instant tells him what to do because he has practice and he has muscle memory. So that's where craft comes in. One can be inspired, but that instant of inspiration can't tell you what to do next if you don't have some, grounding in what you're doing, which really is for poets reading, writing, listening, being in the world, being open to everything. But the instant, moment to moment, tells you what to do when you are immersed in your art, in its practice. And I think you all know that. It's like if you were painting or, obviously certain crafts, like you're trying to sew something, you don't go, oh, all of a sudden the sleeve isn't going to go on. But you might be inspired to do something you never did before, but it could be a ripple in the fabric. The fabric itself might say, you know what, I don't want to do what you want to do to me. I'm resisting you. I think you need to do these, a different kind of stitch entirely. And I think that's what happens is you work with your material. And you have a certain knowledge of your material. And the more knowledge you have of your material, the more you can do with it, the more freedom you have. And that's that paradoxical relationship between what we say is limit or education and freedom. Because if you know the laws of if you know how stone behaves, you're not going to try to get it to do something that is going to break your instruments. But if you don't respect your material and let it tell you what's possible, it's a disaster. Of course, language is so much more complicated to talk about because it's not tactile. But I think we're always trying to make a tactility out of poetry. I mean, I think that's why we make these stanzas. That's why, there's this feeling of wanting to shape something. Am I answering your question at all?
Oh, yes, and more. Let's have some more
But-
student questions. I'm just going to pass this around.
I heard a lot of references to memory and the unconscious mind and even spirituality, and I was wondering what informs and what nourishes your insights into how you approach the material.
I don't know. I don't know. And of course, this is a selection of poems and heavily weighed toward one long poem, which is so unlike my other poems because it's more autobiographical and more narrative. And as I said, it took me 20 years I had the beginning right away. I knew that I had the final lines immediately. Not just the image of the bloated bird, but all those lines, except for the word still. It was mine among them, and then I realized it has to be still because the fabulousness of English is that the word still can mean going on and not moving at the same time, right? Well, what kind of language does stuff like that? It's a monosyllable. Shakespeare riffs on still. Oh my God, which play was that? That passage where the word still occurs about 12 times.
Well, it's in the.
Is it Measure for Measure? I forget.
Much, it's maybe the one you're thinking.
Yeah.
Probably is in a history like Titus.
Yeah.
Where things constantly change.
Yeah.
Things that
Yeah.
hold still. So
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
kept referring to it.
Yeah.
But it's in comedies.
Yeah. I'm being evasive, and I don't mean to be. It's because I truly don't know. You're asking me what my sources are, right? Sort of like asking a magician what the secrets are. But it's even harder because, just being alive, being attentive to things as a child. I think we all have that receptiveness to the world, and it's in childhood, and a lot of people lose that openness, and I think what art gives people is that re-entry to a world that everyone recognizes. You can't be surprised by something if you don't have an expectation, right? And I think that there's this déjà vu experience that occurs in the genuine because we recognize something that we know. We didn't know we knew it. That's where you go, oh my God, you're saying what I thought. But I didn't write it, you wrote it. So how is that possible? Well, it's not so odd, we're the same species. We're dealing with gravity. We all have these issues of, falling versus flying. As long as human beings have physical bodies that are vulnerable and mortal, you're going to have poetry. Because just the double awareness that you could imagine living forever, and yet you know that you're not going to live forever. There's that blows everyone's mind once at the age of about 7 or 8, right? Just consciousness, and a lot of people numb their consciousness because it's unbearable. They can't deal with it, and art is a way of metabolizing almost unbearable beauty and horror. All you have to do is look at the world. It's just, but in a way you have to look at it like this to take it in. And it's through these small windows that we can, and framing them, that we can take in stuff. Craziness is in a way the inability to filter anything. But being spiritually dead is filtering everything out. There's a deep faith in the natural world. My first love was science, cell biology. If I weren't a poet, I would be a cell biologist or a neuroscientist. And I studied language development and psychology and philosophy in college. Neuroscience wasn't really a science yet. It didn't even really exist as a phrase. But being a poet, I sort of have to deal with everything and barely survive. For a long time, I barely could survive financially. So I was doing something that was very risky in terms of just being able to live, but I had to do it. And, you know, we don't really live in a culture that gives people apartments because they're poets. There are cultures really where people, if you reach a certain level of your art, the state supports you. We do have grants and stuff. But we have some support in this country, but there are many cultures. You know, you talk to a cab driver. If I tell a cab driver I am a poet and that cab driver is American, I think his main concern is he will not get a good tip. But if I tell a cab driver I write poetry, or I'm a poet, who is not from this country, what does he or she start talking about? The poets from his or her language, first language. And is so intrigued, is so proud of those things. I remember one cab driver saying, "But you have Shakespeare in your veins." I was like, really? He says, I went to a Tom Stoppard play. I went to it 3 times to try to understand it. I was like, it's just incredible. And it's such a respect for and a love for culture. And Americans don't have that as much there's a huge number of reasons. I mean, just look at our banknotes. It's all politicians. In other countries, it's architects, theologians, poets, novelists. But then again, the other side of it is if you're a country that can't export much in terms of, lots of oil, or what can you export? Oh, I have the best violinist in the world. Think about it. You can't beat me. It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars you have. So this pride that cultures have in their artists, it's often the cultures that are smaller in terms of population and underdogs, sort of the mouse that roared thing, that probably doesn't mean anything to you. But but I think it's changing. I think there's a lot going on in our culture, very alive, I think, a lot to hope for. And I'm very hopeful. Even though there's a lot of reason not to be hopeful and to despair, I'm very hopeful. I just look at your faces. That gives me hope. Because, you're all, yeah, really, you're just so alive. Any other questions?
Well, I think maybe we'll end there, and if people have other questions, you can speak to Phyllis
the book signing.
afterwards. She will be available to sign your books and talk individually for a little while afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phyllis.